Ah, yes.
Well, hello there, and welcome. So, every time I finish an episode, I express a desire to be more frequent, only to be mocked by circumstance and time and myself. Um, Sorry, I've been munching. And so here we are back again, perhaps a bit later than I would have preferred, but back all the same. Let us see. A little up. What do you call it when you a little catching up, maybe? Something like that. So I made a recent very quick trip to Puerto Rico to well, for all intents and purposes, to wrap up this previous chapter of the life of me. Anyway, and you know the next chapter for all I was just set up for. Okay, great. Essentially, the next chapter's already started. I'm living in Georgia. I'm doing what I'm doing. Things are happening and stuff. But I had things down there that were unresolved and left sitting for a while, literally and figuratively. Mostly the literally stuff, but anyway, so yeah, I went and I packed up my apartment and I shipped the iMac back here. It's not here yet, of course, but and things are happening. I'm already off track on all this, but just to say that in addition to the normal delays of life, I had also the delay of making that trip as well. I was hoping that I might get an episode in while I was down there, but time did not really permit. It was a 48-hour trip, literally from like plane landing to plane taking off. And there turned out to be a lot more people to see and a lot more things to do than I was planning, and so I just did get done the things I needed to do. So we're back. Not everyone probably cares about that, but we haven't taken too much time, I don't think. But to business. This is still Harry Potter Abridged, and we are slowly making our way to the Chamber of Secrets. This is book number 2, chapter number 3. And the third chapter in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets is entitled The Burrow, which is actually one of my favorite places and one of my favorite chapters in this particular book. A lot of people have expressed the opinion that this is the And we're kind of splitting hairs here in a way, but the less, well, not exactly, but the lesser of the 7 novels in the series. And I could see it. It's because it has a lot of thematic and plot similarities to the first book, and it's before things get truly dark. Even though the argument definitely can be made and proven, even that dark things have pretty much persisted from the beginning of this story, but things get darker, and just more interesting. Yeah. So that being said, I mean, it's still a great story and you know, full of the good fun and silliness and other things. Right. The Burrow. So Right at the end of the previous chapter, Harry, as you may remember, and see, we're in one of those sections of the book where the chapters follow each other, like literally, just like the next one starts right where the last one ended. So I have to do that because it's been a second, and probably will have been a little while since you've listened to, even though you probably remember. But whatever. Right. At the end of the previous chapter, Harry was dreaming, had one of his perfectly metaphorical dreams, and he wakes up to realize that what he imagined was something. People were looking at him and like through bars in a cage in his dream. Anyway, he wakes up and sees Ron peeking through the bars over his windows, that the bars that Mr. Dursley put up. That is Uncle Vernon. And then he's just like, wait a minute, Ron? And so that's where we start the chapter, is Harry realizing that it's Ron and waking up and sort of jolting to life. And he's like, wait a minute, huh? And Ron's like, right. What the hell? We can't reach you. You're not answering your letters. We don't know what the fuck's going on. And then and also Fred and George are there. So it's the three of them, Ron, Fred, and George. And they are in an old turquoise car, and they are parked in midair right outside of Harry's window. So yeah, Ron's giving Harry the third degree, like, what the fuck? And you got a warning from the ministry. And Harry's like, wait a minute, how do you know that? And he finds out that Ron's father, Mr. Weasley, works for the ministry, which we will learn plenty more about as time goes on. But this is our first introduction to that piece of information. And Ron's like, Ron doesn't know what happened yet and doesn't know anything about Dobby yet, so he thinks that Harry actually did do magic, and he's like, you know better, like, we can't do that, we're not at school. And Harry's like, yeah, you're flying a car. And then Ron's like, oh, no, we're just borrowing this, and plus we didn't do the enchantment, so no, can't make that comparison, even though it seems like you could. But anyway, yeah, and Harry's like, but just, if you could explain to everybody, like, I didn't do that, and also, like, at Hogwarts, like, I'm locked up, I can't get out, blah, 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 and they're like, wait, shh, we got you, son, we got you, son. So, yeah, but Harry's like, but you don't got me. You can't magic me out. And they're like, look what we're doing here. We're in a flying car. Ron also points out, look who I'm with. It's the fucking twins. They could do anything. Yeah. So, right. And so they have a rope and, of course, bars that have been attached to windows there's not like there's any magic on them. So yeah, they floor it and drive the car up into the air and away from the house, and bada boom, bada bing, no more bars on your window. Pow pow. So anyway, so yeah, that's pretty quickly solved. No longer locked in. And then at that point, they start getting Harry's stuff and putting it into the car, and then Harry's like, but I've got, all my stuff, my wand, and all that stuff, and it's all locked under the cupboard, under the stairs, and Fred and George again are like, no, not a problem then. So they pop in and break out, like, lock-picking stuff and get out of Harry's room, and then head down and grab his stuff. And this goes back to, like, I always say that even though obviously Harry's strongest relationships are with Ron and Hermione, Fred and George are like a strong secondary role. more so than even Harry's other classmates, like, or even his dorm mates, Dean, Seamus, and Neville. Like, they're all good friends too. But because Fred and George are Ron's brothers, and he spends more time around that family, and there's like a. Well, I mean, of course, in a lot of ways, the Weasleys sort of adopt Harry in a way, even though he doesn't obviously live with them full time or anything like that. But they take him in and they treat him like family. And so, in a lot of ways, since Harry doesn't have any family, they become his family. But the twins, I don't know, they sort of appeal to a different part of Harry's personality and they just connect on another level. So, anyway, but they also do things for each other, and I guess that's sort of my point too, is that Harry ends up doing something really big for the twins later. And this is just a small, well, it's not really just a small thing. I mean, they're breaking Harry out, and they're facilitating it by, like, picking locks and helping him get his school stuff out and things like that before they take him to relative safety. Which, by the way, I don't know. I always say, like, in the school grounds and stuff, like, Dumbledore always pretty much knows what's going on, but I have to assume that this is one particular thing that Dumbledore will find out about, no doubt, but that he can't really have any way of. He's not truly omniscient, even if Tom Riddle calls him that. He has his limitations, so. You got to think that Fred and George and Ron and Harry are the only ones that know this is actually happening right now, which is pretty great, because this is a period of time, too, before, well, like I said, before things start to get darker and before, like, there are major dangers kind of everywhere. So it's like their biggest dangers are being seen. They're not really in fear of, like, their life or anything like that. So they can do something like this. This kind of practical joke, not practical joke, this is not a joke at all, but this kind of stunt wouldn't fly later on. They couldn't get away with something like this. They wouldn't necessarily even think to try to, because, I mean, Fred and George, even though they're pranksters, they still take certain things seriously. So, anyway, right. So the twins get his stuff, and then they have to heave Harry's trunk into the car, and then at the last minute, let's make sure I'm not skipping anything here. Oh, yeah, at the last minute, Hedwig screeches, and Harry realizes that he hasn't grabbed Hedwig yet, so he grabs the cage. But after the screech, the screech wakes up Uncle Vernon, and Uncle Vernon comes running, and when he goes to knock on the door bangs open because it's not locked anymore, and things get a little crazy, and Uncle Vernon, what does he do? He bellows like an angry bull, and he dives at Harry, and he grabs him by the ankle, and the Weasleys have the rest of his body and his arms, and they're pulling, and Uncle Vernon's shouting, and he's getting away, and all that kind of thing is going on, and then 3 Weasleys against 1 Dursley. They win, and Harry's body moves in the direction of the car, and his leg slides out of Vernon's grasp, and things happen. Right, and then they take off, and again, Harry, instead of just, like, whooping and being happy or whatever, he has to scream or yell out, "See you next summer!" Like, he. I don't know. He has, like, I mean, it's not like he would have ever, like, tried to break out on his own, but once he did, he was like, nah, 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 just for a second, like, that's, in a way, to me, that is actually part of the part of Harry that connects with the twins. But anyway, so there's that. And then, because Hedwig is awesome and Harry's a good pet owner, he's like, let Hedwig out, let her fly. Because she's been locked up in this stupid cage and haven't been able to go hunt or do anything, and so yeah, they let her out and she gets to fly. And then we get to the part about Dobby, as far as Harry explaining what happened with Dobby to Ron and to Fred and George, and they're all like, who could have sent it? And you think it was sent? You know. Let's see. But their thought is that it's somebody's idea of a joke, and that they sent their house elf to tell Harry these things. And then they're also talking about how house elves have like strong like magic, but they can't do things usually without their master's permission or whatever. So, and of course, putting in the fact that house elves are also usually only owned by like larger, or not larger, but more wealthy families or whatever, and that lands, Ron and Harry to thinking that it was Malfoy, because Malfoy is the only person that fits the bill of like being somebody who might try to practical joke Harry into not coming back to Hogwarts, and also being part of a rich family. Which is, great foreshadowing, even though Draco definitely did not send Dobby. But, we know that that's essentially where he came from anyway. Spoiler alert. Oh, and then the twins make the connection to Draco being the son of Lucius Malfoy, and they're like, oh, well, yeah, it must be. It's not exactly a common name, Malfoy. And that's when we learn a little bit of exposition about Malfoy supposedly being in with you-know-who, that is Voldemort. This is what Mr. Weasley has said to or in front of the twins, so they're passing that information on, that they believe he was in Voldemort's inner circle, and that he sort of miraculously came back over to the good side when Voldemort was defeated by Harry as a baby. And so anyway, they're just kind of like theorizing about whether it was Malfoy that was behind the Dobby trick, and anyway. Oh, and so this is just kind of off to the side here, but anyway, Ron's like, yeah, Mom's always wishing we had a house elf to do the ironing, and no, George says that, not Ron, and he says all we've got is a lousy old ghoul in the attic, and gnomes all over the garden. But to this ghoul thing, because the ghoul comes up later, and I never have been able to decide. Well, actually, truth be told, I don't know that I thought about it for a long time, but in rereading this the other day, I couldn't help but think, didn't the Weasleys build the Burrow? And even if not, didn't they add on the extra stories to, like, accommodate for all the children and everything? I mean, that's why it's like, supposedly why it's sort of like, not messy necessarily, but like it's not the most perfectly constructed. It's like just like the stories were just sort of stacked on top of each other, kind of higgledy-piggledy, as it were. So my question is, where the fuck did the ghoul come from? How do you just get a ghoul in the attic? The fuck is a ghoul anyway, exactly? But I mean, clearly it's some sort of other ghostly-like creature, like a poltergeist, like Peeves or something, but it's not exactly, because it's actually, no, it's not ghostly. I take that back. No, it totally is solid. What the fuck is it? And how did it get there? Like, how do you just get a ghoul in the attic? Like, there needs to be like a little, not even short story. Well, yeah, a short story, not a novel, not a novella, but just a little short story. Rolling, get on that, please. Just background and history of ghouls in your universe and how one gets one in the attic. Sounds like a euphemism for something. Anyway, so right. Right, and so Harry's thinking more about Malfoy having living in a big house, a manor house or a mansion or whatever, and like having a house elf that he could send to try and stop Harry from going back to school. Anyway, and Ron's like, yeah, we were worried about you, and he thought maybe something happened to the Errol, and that's when we find out that Errol is the family owl, and then we find out that Hermes is the owl that the Weasleys bought Percy for being made prefect, and then we find out that Percy's been acting oddly this summer because I think it's because he has a girlfriend and he's sending her owls and he's hitting puberty. Traveling, driving, blah, blah, blah. Do you reckon Mr. Weasley works shift work? Because, like, here he's coming in the night. Like, he's been working all night and it's morning now. Because somehow the way the timing worked for, I don't know, maybe the distance from the Burrow to where Harry lives is like hours of driving, but it doesn't seem like it when they're coming back. So I never can figure out, like, sometimes I feel like she does kind of fudge a little bit on time, and I don't know why, but those kind of things bug me a little bit. Like, I mean, and sometimes I'm wrong. Sometimes I reread things and I'm like, oh, no, the timing's accounted for. But it's like people are, and I think other authors do this too. They're like quick to like just get a night over, and suddenly it's the next day, and it's like, wait a minute, it takes a lot of hours to get from one to the other. But anyway, point being is that Mr. Weasley is about to come in from work, and it's obviously morning at this point. If they were going out they're going to go out and denome the garden. That where I'm getting ahead of myself. But anyway, yeah, time, day, night, hours. Things. Right, so we learn a little bit more about Mr. Weasley working at the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office, and they explain to Harry what that is, which, I mean, the name kind of does sort of explain what it is, but, whatever. And some examples of what kind of shit he has to deal with. Just oddly enchanted Muggle artifacts, basically. Also, there's a mention that it's just Mr. Weasley and a warlock called Perkins, and I still don't really understand what the distinction between a wizard and a warlock is either. Like, what makes you one or versus the other? I mean, most everybody that we meet is either a witch or a wizard, which is just a gender thing in this world. So, what's a warlock? I mean, we meet werewolves, obviously, and they're like humans that have been bitten and transform at the full moon, but the rest of the time they're humans too. Warlocks seem to also be human, but are they like a subspecies of human? Is there like some other, like, is it just a title? It's not a title, right? I'm just, I'm looking for your comments is what I'm doing right now. They're not there yet. I'm looking. I'm just kidding. This video's not posted yet. I can't actually look. But I will be looking, okay? Just bear that in mind. So if some of you have answers to these burning questions, like, what the fuck is a warlock? I'll be looking, okay? I get notifications. I get little ding dings to tell me when you've commented sometimes, unless other people see them before I do. Right, and so after they get done explaining about like what Mr. Weasley's department is all about. Which, by the way, again, I still don't have a satisfactory answer to that either. Like if it's just him and Perkins, why is Mr. Weasley sometimes working overnight and getting off in the morning, and then why is it like when Harry has that trial later on in like 3 books from now or something, that Mr. Weasley's going into work at like 7 or 8 in the morning or something? Do they work shift work? Just the two of them? Do they cover the whole day? That doesn't seem right. And also on the day that Harry goes into his thing, Perkins shows up, so they're both working at the same time. So that kind of disputes that idea of shift work. Why is he working overnight again in this book? Maybe something's going on that needed. Maybe he got called in. But then does that turns into a full overnight shift? I got questions. I ain't got no answer though. Anyway, and so Harry's like, so wait a minute, what about this car then? Doesn't this kind of, wait a minute. And they're like, yeah, he's kind of crazy. But he does the same kind of stuff. But of course, obviously, and it becomes even more obvious, but Mr. Weasley's obviously not enchanting muggle things for the purposes of messing with muggles. He's just doing it because he's interested and he's curious and he's experimental and he just likes to fuck around and tinker with things. Like that's it. There's no malicious intent. So anyway, and so they're almost back. And again, like, how far is it? How long will it take before the ice melt and the zombies can come to the island? How long? I don't know. All right, and so we're getting the sign. There's a faint pinkish glow. So we're in the pre-dawn hours at this point. I mean, don't get me wrong. I understand they probably had to wait until midnight or after to make sure that Mrs. Weasley was asleep, and of course Mr. Weasley was at work already. I guess 3 hours there and 3 hours back. That put them maybe around 6, and then maybe the sun's coming up. I could see that. It doesn't really feel like it's been 3 hours, but whatever. I'm just reading a book. And we find out the name of the village that the Weasleys live in is called Ottery St. Catchpole, which, when you're listening to the audiobook, sounds like other words. Unless you're English and you already know what he's saying, and you understand that you hear through the accent perfectly. And so they bring it down the car and they land and they drive into the garage, and then we get the first look at the Burrow. And yeah, it's like what I was saying earlier. There's a stone bottom, and then there's just like rooms that have just been added on kind of randomly, and it sort of looks a little like it might be lopsided. And then and Harry's like, let's see, hang on, where is that part? And there's some chickens. And Harry's like, he thought that it looked like it must have been held up with magic because, it's like not really structurally sound as far as where everything's sort of stacked on top of one another. And then Harry realizes that it probably is held up by magic. And there's a bunch of chimneys, and it's just like an interesting hodgepodge of a house, as it were. But Harry loves it because it's wild and it's weird and it's different and it's nothing like Privet Drive. It's the opposite. It's the anti-Privet Drive, as it were. And of course, Ron's like, "Oh, it's not much, you know. I'm embarrassed about everything." And Harry's like, "No, it's brilliant." And so this is where the part of the plan that Fred and George have is starting to unravel, because they're like, "All right, so we'll just go upstairs and everybody will be quiet, and then in the morning we'll just be like, hey, look who turned up." Which, of course, really, you expect an adult to be like, "Oh, look, Harry Potter just showed up in the middle of the night somehow." That's gonna work. Good plan, Fred and George. Yeah, and so they're heading off to the house, and Ron's like, "Yeah, come on, I sleep at the..." And they see Mrs. Weasley marching across the yard. It's mentioned that she somehow remarkably looks like a saber-toothed tiger, which that's just like an amazing, like, JK likes to like compare people to animals, and especially when it comes to like displaying tempers and, like, you know, severe emotion. And yeah, even Fred and George are like, oh dear. And so yeah, she comes up to them, and that's when we get the big mom telling off, because that's Mrs. Weasley when she's in a towering temper, as it might be stated. She definitely lays into people. And so they try to, they try to be nice, and of course, she's like freaking out about being worried, and they're trying to explain themselves now, and yeah, then she just like explodes on them like a howler from Neville's grandma. Well, no, from a howler from Mrs. Weasley later in the story, right? Anyway. Yeah, it's the angry worried mom bit, which, I mean, you know, they're legit points. I mean, they took a car, they disappeared, she had no idea where they went, you know. And we get the brother comparison thing where she's like, "We never had this kind of trouble from Bill or Charlie or Percy," and Fred is brave enough to mutter like, "Oh, perfect Percy," and that's of course when Mrs. Weasley yells at him about you could do with taking a leaf out of Percy's book. Percy's an interesting character. Not interesting in the way that Fred and George and Ron and Harry and Hermione and most everybody else is, but just interesting as a Anyway, Mrs. Weasley has a lot of things to a lot of points to make, and they're all valid, but there's a lot of them. It even says here in the narrative that it seemed like it could go on for hours. Or no, it seemed to go on for hours. She has a lot of things to address. Anyway, let's see. And somehow she manages to turn to Harry and be like, I'm still very pleased to see you, Harry, of course. And it's like, even though she yells at the kids, Harry being there does still sort of kind of get them off from it being even worse than I suppose it could have been. And so then we get kitchen description. It's small and cramped is the description. We get our first look at one of Mrs. Weasley's strange clocks, because apparently she has two weird ones. This one says things like time to make tea, time to feed the chickens, and you're late. There's books everywhere. A lot of them are household, homemaking type wizarding books. Charm your own cheese, enchantment and baking. My favorite, 1 minute feasts. It's magic. And there's an old radio. And we get our first mention of the popular singing sorceress Celestina Warbeck, who comes up later in the story, a few times actually, probably, because it's one of Mrs. Weasley's favorites. Breakfast is made. Dirty looks are given. Continues to mutter to herself about her sons. And then, she's like, but we don't blame you, Harry, of course. We've been worried about you and all that. So I think that's the other thing that goes on here. Even though she's, like, really pissed at Fred and George and Ron to a lesser degree, but mainly Fred and George, since they're the older siblings in this situation. She's pissed at them for what they did and what the trouble they could have caused. But at the same time, logically, she also is basically saying here that she was worried about Harry too, and that she knew that things weren't right because nobody had been heard from him, and blah 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 blah. Meanwhile, she's feeding them all, but she's really feeding Harry up good, giving him extra stuff. Fred and George both try to speak up about the situation with Harry, and she's like, I'm not hearing it. Don't talk with your mouth full of food. We get a brief appearance from Ginny, who shows up at the bottom of the stairs, squeals, and leaves. Which is kind of weird and funny with the whole precursor to the Harry-Ginny situation later. But it starts with her being a younger girl and being, like, not just infatuated with Harry, but, like, just, kind of maybe even starstruck by him a little bit. She is, I guess. She like, knows that he's famous, and she thinks that he's cute, and that's really all that it can be when you're that age. I mean, Anyway. And we find out that Ginny's been talking about Harry all summer, so she's clearly a little on the obsessed side. But, I mean, these things happen. They're called crushes. And then, of course, Fred tries to pull I'm tired, I'm gonna go to bed. And Mrs. Weasley's like, nah, got some chores for you. It's daylight anyway. So she sends them out to de-gnome the garden, which Harry, even though Harry's given the option of actually going up to bed, decides that he'll go out with them, of course, because, of course, you're not going to go sleep unless you're super exhausted, you're not going to go sleep while everybody else is going out and hanging out doing stuff. Plus, after an exhilarating car ride and a crazy telling off, you're not tired anyway. So anyway, so they're going to be sent to de-gnome the garden, which, by the way, that's another thing. Garden really just means yard, if I'm not mistaken. Whereas in the U.S., when we say garden, we mean like a specific part of a yard, or even just something that's just separate from everything. Where like specific things are grown, not just where grass grows. It's like where you either plant flowers or food or a combination thereof or whatever. Anyway, and we get our first mention of Gilderoy Lockhart because Mrs. Weasley has one of his books that is called, what is it? Oh, it's Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests, because of course it is. And we find out that Mrs. Weasley is kind of taken with Gilderoy Lockhart. And so, yeah, so they're sent out to denome the garden. The gnomes are kind of annoying and silly. We get a comparison to what garden gnomes in the Muggle world are. You know, the little statues that look like, well, we would say Santa Claus. They would say Father Christmas. That's because that's what this book says. But of course, the gnomes in real life in this particular situation don't look anything like Father Christmas or Santa Claus, as it were. They have knobbly bald heads, and they're leathery looking, and they have horny little feet. And so we basically find out that denoming basically means like swing them around in the air until they get dizzy and then toss them over the hedge. And for a while they walk away, and then later they sneak back in. And then, so after we kind of get all that little bit of what I was just saying, they hear the door close, and they realize that Mr. Weasley's home. And of course, unlike children who are actually afraid of their father, they're like, oh, Dad's home. And so even though they got in trouble just a little while ago from their mom, instead of being like, oh, we should probably not go in, they immediately go in, like, quickly. And so, yeah, so they find Mr. Weasley slumped in a kitchen chair, and we get the description of him because this is our first time seeing him. And he's thin and he's going bald, but the little bit of hair that he has left is still red as any of his children's. And he's going on talking about his evening and how were 9 raids. 9, which is a lot. And there's a mention that Mundungus Fletcher tried to put a hex on him when he had his back turned, which is kind of funny because Mundungus ends up being an ally of sorts later in the story. So we get a chance to sort of see that he's always been a bit of a shady character, as it were. And of course, Fred and George are interested too, so they're asking him like if he found anything, because they're always curious about the little crap that he finds and stuff. And we get into a little bit of a discussion about muggle baiting and what it means to to do that, to enchant objects, to basically like screw with muggles and like do things that like fuck with their heads, like shrinking keys is one of the things here that's mentioned. And they disappear, or the muggles will insist that they've disappeared even though they shrunk into like basically non-existence almost. Anyway, in the midst of talking about like enchanted objects and things that the things that he says our lot have taken to enchanting, Mrs. Weasley finds her in right there and says, like cars, for instance. And of course, there's a couple things going on here because like not only did Fred and George take this car without any permission, the other reason why Mrs. Weasley's so upset about it all is that she didn't know the car could fly in the first place because Mr. Weasley kept that information from her. So now she's jumping down his throat, not just because their sons took the car, but because they took a car that flew that she didn't know flew in the first damn place. So she's pissed at everybody, kind of, or at least at Mr. Weasley and at the twins. And so, yeah, now Mr. Weasley's totally off guard, like, cars? What? And so, yeah, she breaks it down, and Mr. Weasley's like, well, you know, if you took a look at the law, you'd find that it was perfectly okay with me enchanting the car, as long as I didn't plan to use it, which we then find that apparently he wrote that law. Which is interesting because in other situations it's sort of indicated that Mr. Weasley's job is not terribly significant, but right here it's like somehow he was involved in the creation of a law. Maybe it's just because of the department he works in and the law is so specific to that department. I don't know. Anyway, and so, yeah, Mrs. Weasley's like, well, this car that you didn't intend to fly was flown last night, and Harry arrived in that car, and Mr. Weasley's like, Harry who? What are you talking about? And then, of course, again, that means that we're at a part of the story where Mr. Weasley and Harry haven't met yet, and so they are. And he's like, oh shit, Harry Potter. Oh, right. Well, nice to meet you. And, Mr. Weasley's totally, like, nonplussed. He's just, like, totally not either purposefully or somewhat just obliviously, like missing the severity of the situation that Mrs. Weasley's pissed off about. And so she pretty much lays it out like, your sons flew that cars out to Harry's house last night and back. And again, Mr. Weasley's like, oh, really? How did it go? And she's like, And then finally he's like, oh yeah, that was very wrong. You shouldn't have done that. And this is where we kind of realize again that it's the twins that are mostly in trouble and not Ron, because Ron's able to like lean over to Harry and be like, hey, let's get the fuck out of here. Like, let them do what they gotta do, say what they gotta say, yell what they gotta yell. And so they do. They slip out and nobody stops them. As Mrs. Weasley swells like a bullfrog, because again, every time somebody gets angry, there's an animal comparison. So they run up the stairs. And it's an uneven staircase, and it zigzags up through the house, which makes sense since apparently the floors are all kind of haphazardly placed on top of one another. They pass by Ginny's room. She's peeking out, and she closes the door with a snap. They finally get up to Ron's room. And there's a description of Ron's room looking like almost like the inside of a furnace, because there's because there's orange everywhere, and we find out that that's the team color for Ron's Quidditch League, the Chudley Cannons, which it says that there's a picture of the same wizards on every wall, and I'm like, how long have the Chudley Cannons had the same lineup? Doesn't that kind of thing change from year to year, or from like every few years to every few years? Do the pictures all magically update, or does he get new posters? How does this work? I don't understand. And of course Ron's like, yep, 9th in the league. And I'm like, how many teams are there? Is 9th really that bad, or is it actually decent? Or is Ron just proud because they're not like the bottom of the league? Also, where's Chudley? I have so many questions. More than I ever had. But as I read these things again, with a microphone in front of me, the questions come. And we see that Ron here, and this never is mentioned again, but Ron has like a series of books, and maybe it's just because of his age or something, but they're the Adventures of Martin Miggs, the Mad Muggle. Yeah, that's never mentioned again. And we just get like a description of like Ron's stuff just sort of being a little untidy, because I mean he's a boy and it's his room. Scabbers is present and sleeping, of course. And there's some cards on the floor. Oh, and that's when we actually get a chance. Harry looks out the window and he happens to catch a glimpse of the gnome sneaking back into the garden. And Ron's like looking at Harry, like looking all like nervous and shit, like he's worried about Harry's opinion. And Ron's like, oh, it's a bit small, nothing like the room you have with the muggles, blah, 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 blah. And I'm underneath the ghoul in the attic. Where the fuck did the ghoul come from? And Harry's like, this is the best house I've ever been in. And Ron doesn't know what to say, so his ears turn pink. Because that's what happens when Ron's either really angry or embarrassed. And that is the end of that chapter. Hooray. We did it. High five. Good job, everyone. We are back for right now. I'm not going to make any predictions. There will be no predictions. I will do this again when I am able to. Obviously, I hope it'll be sooner than later, but whenever it will happen, it will happen. So yeah, there you have it, and I think that pretty much covers it all for now. But and I'm sure not, but as best as I can anyway. So we will see you in the next episode. Have a lovely day, evening, morning, whatever it is that you're having right now. Have it more and more lovely, and we'll see you next time. Peace.